We're going to start with an interesting video. This one is called "It's Not Just You, No One Wants to Have Kids Anymore." Yeah, interesting. I don't know anything about Black Myth Wukong just yet. I've tried to stay away from it. I know that it releases on the 20th. That's in 4 days. Game Ranks actually just dropped a video about it, so we might be checking that out in a moment. But it's supposed to be a... Well, if we like Shadow of the Erdtree's difficulty, that is something that one will enjoy. So, just in a moment, we'll be checking that out. Okay, let's check this video first then.
Fertility rate drops to another historic low. The US fertility rate drops to another historic low. Births in Japan hit record low. Italy's national birth rate is declared a national emergency. Nearly every country is due to shrink by 2100. There's little to no doubt that there's like an ongoing fertility crisis. People are choosing to not have babies anymore.
My apologies, let me repeat. The question was asked, isn't that a good thing since Earth is very overpopulated? The thing with overpopulation is that it's not exactly what we were meant to understand. It's not exactly about the resources that we have. We are already having fewer babies. Plain and simple, because of how many of us are, at least in first world countries, are dealing with life. Things are getting more expensive. People want to get more into careers, especially women now who have the opportunity to do so. And we also realize for many people now, even when they have the opportunity, like let's say a phenomenon that we are observing very much here in Denmark, my girlfriend, bless her, has been getting very much into scientifically approaching motherhood by reading research papers and books and stuff. And we've seen a bunch of research on how it is that even those who have the means to have lavish lifestyle actually prefers, after having their first kid, to not have more. If they have like a desire to have 5, it ends up just being 2 or 3, because career becomes somewhat more important. There is just not that much of a desire to have children. Now, when it comes to resources though, and or feeding the populace, it's not what most people think. Because in the past, there was this myth that came out of industrialization, that we could not manage to feed as many people as we would think we could. That was mainly a thing around the 1800s. England experienced that. I remember talking about that with some friends within the medical fields, about in Hungary. Funny, Hungary. It's a dumb joke, sorry. But like, it was a thing about resources that we could not feed people. But that is not what we're experiencing today. It's not about how much we can feed people, but how we can transport the resources or the food to get to people. We are wasting so much food. Having people fed is not the issue, but yeah, before I get too much yapping, let's actually see what the point here is.
South Korea to the United States to Norway to Taiwan, pretty much every rich country. And you might not think this is a problem, but it is a problem for a few reasons. The reality is that people are living longer than ever at the moment. When people start to live this long, you need new workers to replace the ones that are retiring.
Or this.
You need new workers to pay taxes that will eventually fund the pensions of those who retire. And you need young people in the workforce to take care of those older people. In the 1960s, there were 6 people of working age for every retired person. And by 2035, it's expected to be 2 to 1. This is one of those topics where if you ask 5 different people, you'll get 5 completely different answers as to what the reason is. People tend to have quite strong opinions. Some people might say it's a cost of living issue. Some people might say that it's to do with declining rates of religion in the world. Some people might blame women's liberation movements, for example. Either way, no matter what people say, they're typically pretty certain that either their experience or their belief is the reason why, on a global scale, people aren't having children. I think we can do better than that, because when I see that there's a problem that is affecting Norway, the US, Taiwan, and France,
equally,
I tell myself that There's got to be like a better
not equally,
answer that
but
we
yeah.
can give, right? Because these countries are completely different. The childcare situation, for example, in Norway is vastly different to the childcare situation in the US, which is vastly different to the UK. So I feel like...
Bruh, if you live in Norway, you are so well. Actually only have like 3 like close, not two close friends and one not so close from Norway. One was a classmate of mine called Mats, like Mats Mikkelsen, but with a T instead. Yeah, that's Norwegians for you. But they do spend a lot of money on childcare. And I think that the average Norwegian is said to have like 500,000 estimate spent on them. They're doing well. I think, yeah, kids, oh God. Yeah, but it's true though. You don't choose your spawn point.
we can get a better answer than just this one-line solution of, oh, it's the cost of living. I think we can do better. If you'd asked me, to be honest, like even just a couple of weeks ago, I would have put the blame squarely on the cost of housing. In fact, there's this one chart that lives like in my head rent-free. It's a chart that compares the growth of house prices to the growth of incomes in the UK. And intuitively, to me, it feels like that's why people wouldn't want to have kids. And to a lot of people, it feels that way. But I want to challenge my intuition, and maybe we can reach a more nuanced answer as to what.
Are you recording? I'm pretty much just chilling with chat, but you just reminded me that I should actually be recording my streams because YouTube has this stupid thing of only saving streams at 720p. At least allowing you to download them at 720p, so that's bad. So allow me to actually record this.
Why this is more of a global problem than necessarily a specific localized problem. For example, this is a piece of research from the US, which tried to establish what the effect of a $10,000 increase in housing would be on people's decision to have kids. Unsurprisingly, if house prices go up, it corresponds to a 2.4% drop in the decision to have kids if you are renting. However, if you own your home, you actually become more likely to have kids as house prices go up. The net effect of this is that when house prices go up in the US, more people actually want to have kids, which is really counterintuitive. But there is some variance because in the UK, the effect of increasing house prices is a net decrease. And this is just one piece of evidence that immediately helps us understand that we can't just think of this problem as a one-line solution.
Living,
Clearly, housing can't explain the full picture. I think the cost of having children is another huge factor that people typically fall back on when they explain the reasons why people aren't having kids. It's too expensive. However, it seems that even paying people to have kids isn't working very well.
Yeah, Japan tried that. If those of you who were present during the Geopol reaction video there for why Japan isn't perfect, they are forcing young people, at least not forcing, but urging them to get into less urban areas and move to rural ones by even giving them money to do so and to have kids. Didn't turn out well. That's what happens when generational demonization of, not being a workhorse leads to. If you got to choose where will you spawn, North Korea will be empty, lol. Well, then again, it has to do with whether or not a dictator is running the place, right? I mean, geographically speaking, North Korea is in a nice location.
Taiwan has spent more than $3 billion trying to get its citizens to have more children, and it's had no success at all. In France, they've spent even more money, about 4% of their GDP, on various measures to encourage people to have children. To put this into perspective, if the US spent 4% of its GDP on family measures, that would be the equivalent of the entire defense budget. So countries are actually, some countries at least, are actually spending a huge amount of money on things like tax breaks, things like direct cash transfers, and things like childcare benefits to encourage people to have kids. So
that also has to do with how the government spends the money, at least allocates those resources. Just like was mentioned there with France and so on. We have a weird situation right now, actually a calculation that my girlfriend and I said and did with regards to, what was it? Yes, if you remember, some of you would have come across this story. Let me find it. It was during the pandemic. There were Zombie minks in Denmark. Yes, this one. The Guardian. Here we go. Cold mink rises from the from the dead to Denmark's horror. So we had a situation here where a bunch of farmers who had a failing business had years over years never reported their losses correctly, and eventually when the pandemic happened, a bunch of the mink died. Also, in order to be consistent here, it should be stated that in 2020, as the virus was spreading, in the northern part of the Jutland Isle, which is one of the 3 major islands that make up Denmark, they found a great number of infection amongst the mink, which our Prime Minister actually prompted a lot of farmers to unalive them. So a vast majority of them didn't just die because of viral infection, but actually were killed by the farmers themselves. She was very much hounded for giving such a massive kill order, as her decision felt as humane as the practice of mink breeding itself. But in a weird twist of irony, it turned out that the move was actually a good thing for the climate. As if you factor for such emissions as CO2, according to engineers, the closure of the industry, which was banned for some time, has saved the climate around 171,000 tons of CO2 each year, which corresponds to an annual emission of 71,000 cars. And it was a huge failure for the enterprise. It ended up being so bad. Yes, because of noxious gases. That's why the minks were rising from the grave. It wasn't actually zombie minks. Like, their bodies were getting back to the surfaces because there were such massive mass graves that buried them. But back to the main subject, in fact. Because of those immense losses, the government had to somehow help them along, because that's a thing that we do here when businesses are failing, especially for self-employed people. The issue with that is that it's taxpayer money, and nobody was going to be willing to pay the sum that they concluded was necessary. You want to guess how much we had to pay? Around, I think, 200 or so farmers in total. Can any of you in chat imagine the sum that had to be paid? Just a wild guess. 20 billion? Well, that's close. 30. 30 was the conclusion. 30 freaking billion. Did these farmers who had failing businesses year after year demand that the whole of the state had to pay through the taxpayer money that we had to refund to them for a period of 9 years? We have a massive bridge here that connects all of our islands. Storbitsbron. This thing here, this massive bridge, which is actually a section of 3 bridges that go across the 3 islands of Denmark, cost, I think, 15 or 20 billion to make. That's how much they wanted us to pay them. People said, fuck no. There were protests and everything across the country. The point that I'm trying to get at here is that when it comes to childcare, okay? I know, it's a little bit of a roundabout to get to my actual point. When it comes to childcare, there is a possibility to actually help parents along. We have actually had laws here that make sure that now dads as well have the opportunity to have prolonged prolonged leaves from work to actually be with the newborns, and so along with the mothers as well. Now, we could extend that period for a whole year for every single parent in this country, and that will only cost us 5 billion. We did the math. And it's kind of wild that the government is like misusing the funds and wanting to pay some idiots who literally could not take care of the animals and actually misuse them, because that's one of the worst way of farming minks, is by actually putting them in stressful situation, which forces them to have more offsprings. It's very disturbing. There were a whole discussion about the efficacy of the work. It's gross. But yeah, we've did the math and found that the government is fucking around. They could be allocating funds in a way better way to actually help citizens along, because at the end of the day, that's what they want. Just workforce. They want us to produce new taxpayers and not essentially guarantee whether or not kids are being raised in a good environment. That's not the priority. So yeah, both from the animal perspective, that's a bad take for them to focus on that work. It should more or less be abolished. Again, it's for luxury brands at the end of the day. So who gives a fuck? And I'm sorry for my French, but yeah, it's kind of gross. Anyways, a little bit of an educational story there. Back to the video.
Clearly, there's a bit more to this whole situation than meets the eye initially. And I think we can maybe look at some of the research.
They definitely do take cuts from the government. So that's another point there that you're making, dude. It's wild.
Research and evidence, because there is a whole body of research and evidence to engage with. And I've tried to find the best bits to share it with you. And I'm curious to hear what your opinions are on these different aspects. What I do find really interesting is like how the narrative has changed around this topic, because a couple of decades ago, overpopulation was all the rage. All of the discussion around the number of people on Earth revolved around the fact that there were too many people, and we have two people to blame for this.
We're getting to this
First
point.
of all, we have this dude here. His name is Thomas Malthus, and he is an 18th century economist. And he was the first major figure to really write about this idea of a population boom. He saw that the quality of life in 18th century England was dropping pretty quickly. And he said that there was just too many people and that we'd get to a point where there wouldn't be enough food to sustain the growing population. And a couple of decades later, another professor wrote about the same topic. His name was Paul Ehrlich. And he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And people really believed them. To kind of put into perspective how scared people were of overpopulation, I want to share a quote by the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, who said that overpopulation could be more explosive than the atomic or hydrogen bomb. Even on the other side of the world, in China, these fears of overpopulation promoted China's decision to implement their one-child policy.
That stuff ruined so many lives, man. Ooh, it's been some years since I heard that talking point, but that young men were lacking potential spouses because there were just way too many boys. As some of you will remember, the one-child policy had a caveat with it for those families who eventually ended up having more than just one child. If it was a boy, it was preferable that he was a boy and not a girl. So many had to take weird means to not have them.
Whole package of laws and regulations designed to stop Chinese people from having more than one child. If we fast forward to today, those fears were like clearly unfounded. I think most of us understand that food insecurity is a distribution problem and not an agriculture problem. And instead, we've ended up in the situation where underpopulation is the problem, where there are not enough young people. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the US specifically, because I think...
Yeah, we had a report here recently where Premier Minister, right? That's how you say it, right, in English? I tend to forget who came forth and said that if we don't do something about our declining birth rate, about to 2100, our population will be halved. We are currently sitting at close to 6 million, so yeah, not looking good. Prime Minister, thank you. Thank you for the correction. It's annoying because I have the French version, the English version, the Danish version just sitting in my head, just bouncing around like, what's the right word to say here, Jack?
I think they've got some really interesting factors that paint a different picture of the fertility crisis to the one that you might have in your head at the moment. This is a graph of the US fertility rates, and it's the kind of graph that makes you want to jump to a specific conclusion or a one-line answer as to what's going on here. But the real interesting part of this graph isn't what it looks like now, it's what it looks like when you kind of break it down by demographics. And thankfully, The Economist has done this for me. If we look at birth rate divided by age, we see some really interesting trends. Somewhat surprisingly, the fertility rate amongst women over 30 has actually been steadily rising since the 1990s. However, you might see something else that's quite interesting. Birth rates amongst 15 to 19-year-old women in the US dropped dramatically.
Yeah, hopefully it did. Hopefully. Oh, Jesus. Okay, like, I get the one for most in the 30s. That's also where, statistically speaking, we've seen that most people tend to have children nowadays, at least in our society, because people want to attain careers. You get through university's done, you need to have a certain amount of years in the workplace so that you are guaranteed to have at least somewhat set to know how your mortgage is going to look like, get a house, all those things, and then you start thinking about forming a family. That's why people like myself are a bit of an outlier, right? But this has also to do with how biology works. And it's incredibly unfair. For most of us guys, we can have children whenever. Until even the age of 70, 80, who knows. For women, the most fertile ages are between the late teens and early 20s. By the times that you are in your 30s, that actually start declining severely. And yeah, of course, there's been a hell of a lot of things with men as well. As some of you will know and have seen some of the research, we have a shit ton of microplastic in our balls. So we're kind of screwed as well in that department. That's why you should urge yourself to try to eat somewhat healthy and exercise, because the food that we consume is already kind of fucked, and the clothes we wear contribute to having our seed quality being kind of bad. What, you didn't know? You didn't know that we had microplastic in our balls? Microplastic in testicles. There you go. I didn't even need to finish typing it. It literally showed up. So yeah, you can read that for yourself.
No, I don't think I will.
The actual figure is 77%, and they actually explain that more than half of the drop in America's total fertility rate is driven by women under 19 choosing to no longer have kids. Around a third of these births would have been unplanned, and the majority of these births would have been on low incomes as well. In the UK, we actually see a similar trend where women at age 20 are having half as many children. Unlike richer women, these young women are not going to compensate by having more kids in the future. And I actually want to take a brief second to have a little aside and talk about the fact that
I'm sorry. I was trying to listen to this, but then I read a comment, plastic is there to reinforce them. Jesus. Yes, the previous generation had lead and coal. Yeah, we're stuck with plastic. Just another byproduct of the earth. Let's go back a little bit.
And the majority of these births would have been on low incomes as well. In the UK, we actually see a similar trend where women at age 20 are having half as many children. Unlike richer women, these young women are not going to compensate by having more kids in the future. And I actually want to take a brief second to have a little aside and talk about the fact that often the most vilified group of people are actually the most important group of people to society. I'm sure you've heard young single mothers described as a burden on society or as lazy, but clearly these women were actually the backbone of the economy. It's an aspect that I feel many people don't actually think about. Obviously, it would be unreasonable.
I think that this often has to do with the unfortunate, state where there just isn't enough people around to help. I think that most single parents, actually, whether it is young women or fathers, often find themselves in a situation where they don't have that either safety net or just people around to help. That's why there's always the thing that concurrent studies that keep on showing that the more people are involved in raising a child, the better it is. That's why I remember many always those anthropologists who like go to foreign countries or third world countries like my own, where I was born. We have a big social safety net of like a whole extended family that actually lives close. So everybody can take care of a child. I was raised separate from my parents, living in two completely different countries, but I had my whole family there to help. My grandma, who raised me for the most, well, a good number of time, because my dad was a workhorse who never wanted to be at home. One hell of a dad. Let me not trauma dump on you guys, but yeah. And then later on, got the chance to live with my mom, where I then got the wonderful life of both having a father and a mom there. So that's how it is. And the same thing goes for the talking point that is often applied of, oh, single mothers or gay parents and stuff like that. Like, the more people are just involved in raising a child, the better, as long as the parents are doing a good job. That's how it is. It's as simple as that.
Reasonable to say that the reason that no one is having kids is purely because teen pregnancies are down. The economic aspect of it is clearly like important. It's clearly relevant. I don't think it's a coincidence if you look in this graph that the countries that have the lowest fertility rate in Europe, countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece, are also the countries with the highest youth unemployment, the countries where young people live with their parents for the longest, and the economy is in the bin, basically. And if you just ask young adults why they're not having kids, a lot of them will say that it's simply because childcare is too expensive. What I do find interesting, though, is that the fertility crisis is one that affects the whole world, and it affects countries that spend an incredible amount of money on social programs for kids.
Right.
So this is a quote by Robert Reich. If you don't know who Robert Reich is, he was US Secretary of Labor. He says that Norway spends around $30,000 per child on early childhood care. Finland spends $23,000.
Oh no.
Germany spends $18,000. And the US spends $500 per.
Oh no. The US, what are you doing? Are those numbers contested? No way. Come on. Wow. That's not a lot. That's not a lot at all. Capitalism, baby. Yeah. We better go to war, boy. What about a child? Who cares? The child yearns for the mine.
Per child. Obviously, the US has a huge childcare spending problem. It just doesn't want to invest in young children. But Norway, which is spending incredible amounts on early childhood care, is still seeing a below replacement birth rate. And when we talk about this problem, we tend to lump men and women in together as if their experience of having children is identical, when there are actually.
Estonia. How much does Estonia spend on child care? Child. Jesus. Okay. 0.0 of the GDP. Access denied. What was this from? The Times? Okay. Right. But that's interesting. 8%. Okay. With all possible addition to the 20% tax income of the percentage of which the government, Estonia has 30% social task that employs. Yeah, that's around the same amount that we have here. Anyways, back to it.
Some pretty significant differences that can at least help us explain some more of the trend towards choosing to not have children. And one of these big factors is the fact that women's earnings drop significantly after having a child. And that drop persists decades after they have children. This is not so much of a problem for men. Men who choose to have kids don't earn significantly less than men who don't choose to have kids. And they don't also experience a short-term drop in the amount that they earn. Gender-based differences in terms of the experience of childcare, I think are a remarkably important factor, because ultimately you need two people to have a child. This tracks with the work of Dr. Matthias Dupke. He's like the guy to talk about family economics. It's his area of specialty. He talks at length about the differences between low fertility countries and ultra low fertility countries. In the countries that have the lowest levels of fertility, there is a clear trend of women taking on a greater percentage of the burden of childcare.
Right.
So in the really low fertility countries, the percentage of childcare duties that is taken on by women can be...
Yeah, we all do this, us weebs, and actually ended up because I had a period of watching a lot of K-dramas. Yeah, a lot of South Korean and Japanese women are forced to stay at home and take care of children, but going back to work, it's not really an option for many of them, at least for a long time. That's why they always are so adamant at pursuing careers there, because what other opportunities do they have? That's how the real wage gap comes into play here. It comes to how can you actually get back to work once you have that thing that biologically doesn't allow you to do that as a man would. That sucks.
As high as 80%. In countries that have slightly better fertility ratios, this percentage is much closer to 50-50. There's still a huge stigma in some of these countries, particularly South Korea and Japan, where women are still expected to spend huge amounts of time at home taking care of children, but they can't survive without having a career, or they simply just want a career, which is also very reasonable. The decision to have kids is, in some extent, a signal of optimism.
I'm sorry, need to go back to that. I like how this is like the peak moment that everybody watched. In 1920, we took children out of the coal mines. In 2020, the most popular video game on the market is Minecraft. The children yearn for the mines. Oh man, that's the tweet. That's the tweet. Jesus Christ. Let's make the children space kings. Oh, God.
Is in
Emperor.
some extent a signal of optimism, right? A signal in the belief that you'll have a good future, your kid will have a good future, and the world on the whole has a good future ahead of it. And I think these disparate factors all play into a single idea of optimism about the world. There's a really good research group called Our World in Data. They're amazing. They compiled some data on how optimistic people feel about the world. And you can see that there's this concentration of rich, low fertility countries at the bottom of this graph. And I think it helps us at least explain somewhat why the countries that are even trialing just direct one-off cash payments are not seeing remarkable improvement. Giving someone a one-off payment doesn't necessarily make them feel like the world is going to be a better place in the next 5, 10, 15 years. On the other hand, places like Taiwan have tried extended maternity leave, and that hasn't worked because that has actually increased the risk for women. They're going to be out of the workforce for longer, and they're going to struggle to recover the income that they once had. There are these macro factors like the gender wage gap, which are kind of creating like a negative pressure, and it's not enough to balance that negative pressure. But importantly, it's also worth mentioning that a lot of the drop in fertility is actually a good thing. It represents that people have agency. People can actually choose whether or not to have children, especially women. In fact, we use the term fertility crisis when it's not really a fertility crisis, it's a worker crisis. Governments aren't trying to create self-actualized, happy, positive individuals. They're trying to create meat for the grinder.
Oof, meat for the grinder. Jesus, man. You didn't need to hit us that hard with that last quote.